The world was shocked by scenes of Trump supporting extremists, insurrectionists even, storming the US Capitol in what's widely been described as a coup attempt. And there was a lot of shock and outrage from a lot of the traditional American elite. According to George W. Bush, this is how elections are disputed in a banana republic, not our democratic republic. It was variously described as very, very un-American. This is not how Americans do democracy. Well, we're going to talk about this. If you're just joining us, please do subscribe, press the like button, and if you want to support us on Patreon, hugely appreciated. I'm very glad to be joined by a phenomenal expert, the award-winning journalist Vincent Bevins. He's covered Latin America, Southeast Asia for newspapers like the Financial Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post. He's the author of the must-read The Jakarta Method, which documents US support for the bloodbath following the Indonesian coup in 1965. That received rave reviews, so do get yourself a copy. Vincent, hello.
Hello. Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Good to have some great expertise on. So, look, come on. What happened in the US was pretty bad. I think we'd all agree on that. Some people describe it as an attempted coup. It was described by Joe Biden as an insurrection. But while US politicians, they've decried this as alien to the traditions of their country and against everything the US stands for, is that true?
No, absolutely not. I think what's different is where you saw it happen, right? So that quote you cited from George W. Bush is really interesting because he used banana republic, which is a pretty odious thing to say, especially when you're a former president of the United States, because if we take those words on their own terms, banana republic, as it was coined by O. Henry at the beginning of the 20th century, was meant to describe the countries who had political systems that were corrupt as a result of the specific intentional intervention of U.S. foreign policy and American companies, specifically the United Fruit Company. And I think it's pretty ironic and fitting that as we all sort of struggle to decide, is this a coup, is this not a coup, any conversation like that in the 21st century will inevitably refer back to the sort of classics of the genre, the real axiom, the real sort of the right-wing coups that really defined what it means to carry out this kind of an insurrection. And these are the US-backed regime change operations that took place largely after World War II in the global South. These are the ones that we're going to refer to always when deciding whether or not what happened in Washington on January 6th was indeed some kind of an attempted coup. Those are, as I said, the classics of the genre.
So US interventions in foreign countries are very extensive, very, very widespread. What we're going to do is talk about 5 major examples of US-backed coups that people generally are not taught about properly. And we're going to talk about that history, what happened, and what the consequences were.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's a good idea, not only at this moment but for the United States and Britain in general. Sort of confronting this history is really important to conducting any kind of responsible politics going forward. And when the 5 that come to mind, I think, are Iran 53, Guatemala 54, Brazil 64, Indonesia 65, and then Chile 1973.
So it's Iran. It's 1953. Who's in power and what's going on?
Yeah, no, so this is a really important coup. It's actually the one that I know the least about of the 5 because I don't speak Farsi. I haven't met people who were directly affected by it, as I did in the case of the other 4. But the context here is really important, right? So the United States has just finished, emerged from World War II as by far the most powerful country on earth, and this is a new role for it. This is not something that the United States had been used to doing, going around the world and trying to figure out how to affect outcomes. Great Britain was, right? So in 1953, a man named Mossadegh was in charge of a young and imperfect democracy in Iran. And he ended up threatening, in a very concrete way, the commercial interests of British Petroleum. It had a different name at the time, but it was essentially the British government pushing the United States to get involved, primarily for commercial interests that led to the coup. And the idea was to stop Mossadegh from getting his hands on any of his own country's oil revenues, but then to remove him at whatever cost. And this, there was a dynamic here, which sort of, again, became really important through the rest of the 20th century, is that there was commercial interest, but there was always geopolitical interest, right? So the British were leaning upon the CIA, which was younger and sort of more inexperienced, but much better funded than MI6 to get involved. And the main reason was oil. But then also they turned to the Americans and said, hey, but also communism. Maybe if we don't do this, communism. Have you thought about that? Communism. And this was what pushed Washington over the edge to organize a real mass campaign of kind of wanton chaos in the streets of Iran, and to mount numerous attempts to overthrow Mossadegh. Now, this is all pretty uncontroversial now. It was called Operation Ajax on the American side. On the British side, it was called Operation Boots. And there were some really bizarre scenes that emerged out of this attempt to finally get rid of Mossadegh. I'm just going to read really quickly from my own book, because as I said, this is not the one that I know the best. So Kermit Roosevelt, the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, had $1 million to spend in Iran as he pleased, a huge sum for the kind of help he wanted to buy. The CIA bribed every politician it could and looked for a general willing to take over and install the Shah as dictator. Agents paid street thugs, strongmen, and circus performers to riot throughout Tehran. When CIA Station Chief Roger Guérin, I don't know if that's pronounced right, argued that the US was making a historic mistake by aligning itself with British colonialism, Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, recalled him to Washington. The CIA created pamphlets and posters proclaiming that Mossadegh was a communist and enemy of Islam. They paid off journalists to write that he was a Jew. The CIA hired gangsters to pretend to be Communist Party members and attack a mosque. Two of Roosevelt's Iranian agents, who were handling some of the hired muscle, tried to turn down further work at one point, saying the risk was becoming too great. But Roosevelt convinced him by saying that if they refused, he'd kill them. And in the end, through a series of maneuvers that were apparently illegal and then others that were very illegal, they got rid of Mossadegh, arrested him, and established a dictatorship led by the Shah, who for the next few decades was one of the most reliable pro-Western, pro-American, pro-British leaders in the global South.
And of course, that worked out really well in the long term in Iran.
Yes, I mean, this is a really interesting dynamic that I go through in my book, is that you can kind of see, if you go through all of the second half of the 20th century, the United States getting better at doing imperialism. Like in the first years after World War II, they're sort of doing like adolescent or infantile imperialism when they're screwing up.
Guatemala, 1954, just a year after the Iranian coup. Who's in charge, and why is the United States getting a bit squeamish?
So this is a classic case of the long-term consequences of the quote-unquote banana republics. Again, I never use that term unless critiquing someone that's used it themselves. But George Bush did use it. So in Guatemala, the largest country in Central America, the United Fruit Company, now Chiquita Banana, had really controlled the economy for a very long time. But after World War II, you had, again, another young and imperfect democracy emerging in this country. And Jacobo Arbenz was the young, left-leaning, but certainly not revolutionary communist leader. He said that he wanted to bring drag Guatemala out of feudalism into capitalism. That's more or less what he was trying to do. A big part of this was land reform. A lot of the land in the country was owned or controlled by United Fruit. And he wanted to conduct a land reform based on the existing claims that company had been making about its ownership of land in the country. However, the tax reporting that the United Fruit had been doing had been so absolutely distorted that they were going to end up getting very little for the land that they owned under this reform program. But largely speaking, he wanted to take a little bit of control back over the country, give some more land to Guatemalans, and at least insist on some kind of legal framework for the a large American corporation that was operating in the country. Now, again, there was a communist party in Guatemala. They existed. They had some important role in the country in the first half of the 20th century, but they were very, very far from taking power. And on the international stage, Arbenz had repeatedly aligned itself with anti-Soviet positions at the UN and so forth. So United Fruit starts organizing press junkets for Western journalists, a real all-out, well-funded and well-coordinated press relations campaign to get American journalists to print stories saying that Guatemala could fall to communism. The CIA, again, gets very active and decides that they're going to come up with a plan to overthrow Arbenz. Now, they find a general, one that's not really liked very well within Guatemala, take him outside the country, spread disinformation within Guatemala that there's a rebellion brewing, and this disinformation is reproduced almost verbatim and uncritically in large outlets in the United States, like the New York Times. The CIA actually requested that the New York Times take one of its more, let's say, curious reporters off of the beat, and they did so at the behest of the Central Intelligence Agency. And then they started to terrorize again the Capitol with the goal of creating confusion and creating this idea that the government was going to fall, that order had to be restored. They bombed downtown Guatemala City, but they weren't real bombs. They were just sort of smoke and sound bombs meant to terrorize the population. They did terrorize those people. I met a lot of people that still can remember that fear to this day. And then they convinced Arbenz that he had to go. And again, if you're in Central America in 1954, you know that if the Yankees are coming, your days are numbered. He did step aside, thinking that there'd be some kind of a smooth transition to the military, the real military, but instead Washington insisted upon this guy that it had grabbed itself, and then insisted upon the mass execution of the left in Guatemala. So there were the potential enemies of the regime were murdered at the behest of Washington, and this fell apart very quickly into civil war, and that civil war went on for decades. Central America had a terrible second half of the 20th century. This civil war ultimately ended in hundreds of thousands of innocent people being intentionally murdered for their real or perceived left-wing political sympathies. Largely, this has been considered a genocide against the indigenous population, the Mayan peoples of Guatemala. And again, within the CIA, and this is something I should have brought up with Iran, within the Washington foreign policy establishment, this was like, oh, this is amazing. We don't have to go to war. President Eisenhower hadn't liked the Korean War. It was very difficult. He didn't like committing soldiers. He thought that he had discovered this trick where you could flip countries with, by bribing people, by causing a ruckus, by insisting upon order be restored the way that you demand. And then now you have an ally. And they really wanted, from this point on, to replicate these two successes across the rest of the global South in the Cold War.
Brazil is the most populous country in Latin America. A decade after the events in Guatemala, what's happening in Brazil?
Yeah, so Brazil's a really interesting one. And again, there's a lot, the CIA did a lot between 54 to 64. But Brazil is really interesting because, as you said, it's such a big country. But it was the kind of coup where there wasn't this obvious and external U.S. Intervention. There was, again, a liberal-minded reformer, hardly a radical leftist, named João Jango Goulart. Django maybe is the quickest, easiest way to refer to him in English. And we now have a recording of John F. Kennedy in 1962 speaking to his ambassador saying, let's let the military know that if they want to get rid of this guy, we have their back. And over the next few years, there was intermittent attempts to make things very difficult for him economically. But politically, he already had the cards stacked against him. He domestically, a large part of the middle class and political elites didn't like his presidency in the first place. And he tried to force a sort of strengthening of his own position just based on the fact that the regular people liked him. That doesn't tend to work in South America then. It doesn't work now. The elites reacted very strongly, and then they began to organize a coup against him. Now, Washington set up something called Operation Brother Sam, which was going to supply military assistance to the right-wing coup to overthrow Django, but it ended up not being needed. And this is an important thing about this sort of, as I said, the maturation of the coup process in American foreign policy. The military kind of did it themselves. They did it because the United States told them they could. They did it knowing that they had the support of the United States if things got hot. But they did manage to whip up a sort of domestic protest movement, although certainly not a majority of the people, enough to create this idea like, oh, we're going to take power. And then they took power and they had the support of the local elites. It wasn't like these obviously paid actors just sort of smashing things up and everybody knowing this is a very farcical attempt to disguise foreign intervention. But what happened so importantly with Brazil is that they established a very stable regime. Brazil does not devolve into civil war as Guatemala does. Brazil does not have a revolution that overthrows it like Iran does in 1979. The oligarchy, military and political, that took power in 1964 is largely still in power. There was the end of the formal dictatorship, but the basic social conditions established in 1964 are still there now. And really importantly, Brazil was active in flipping other countries in South America from the sort of wobbly, global South-centric, liberal-minded, reformist third way. I mean, it wouldn't be the third way. Sort of the third world movement is the best, the term that was used at the time, to flip countries from being somewhere in between capitalism and socialism to very firmly in the violent anti-communist camp. First, so Bolivia and Uruguay. This is very underappreciated. They helped to flip those two countries into the anti-communist camp. And then they began very actively working behind the scenes after the election of Salvador Allende in Chile in 1970 to make sure that his presidency did not last very long.
One of the bloodiest events of the 20th century, which most people just aren't aware of, took place in Indonesia from 1965 onwards. It was actually documented in a film in 1982, The Year of Living Dangerously, starring Mel Gibson. If anyone wants to catch up on that dramatization of what happened in those events. But just tell us about Indonesia. A guy called Sukarno's in charge. Who is he? Why don't the West like him? And what does the US, what's the US involvement? And tell us, what are the human consequences?
Yes, I mentioned really briefly the third world movement in the Brazil section. And I think it's important to reestablish what that meant. When the peoples of Africa and Asia ended formal colonialism soon after World War II, there was this very optimistic, forward-thinking, energetic, and proud project to take their place alongside the First World, which was the formerly imperialist West, and the Second World, which is the Soviet Union. And this was what the Third World is. The Third World now has been degraded in the English language because of the racists that have used it over the last few decades. But the Third World movement was a project to say, we're now free, formal colonialism is over, and we are going to remake the world. We're going to take our place alongside the white countries that used to exploit us. Now, Sukarno was one of the founders and major proponents of this movement. Now, again, Indonesia, we often forget this, but it's a very large and important country. It's the fourth largest country in the world by population. Everyone in the 1960s in Washington agreed that Indonesia was more important than Vietnam as a foreign policy consideration. Sukarno, who had been in power since he successfully expelled the Dutch, who tried to reconquer the country, just like Vietnam tried to reconquer France with U.S. support in the first years after World War II, had been governing through this very Indonesian and very innovative collaboration with Islamic forces, left-wing and often Marxist forces, and nationalist forces. Indonesia is a very diverse country. In order to govern a country like that, you have to have this very creative approach to ideology. Now, the U.S. went back and forth on whether or not this man was tolerable from 1945 to 1955. In 1955, when he organized the Bandung Conference to bring together the peoples of the Third World to really stand up to American and British power, really just to reformulate the rules of the world economy, the CIA started to try to get rid of him, right? So in 1955, they started to try to pay off right-wing parties in the country. And they were very alarmed that the Communist Party, which was entirely unarmed and peaceful, kept doing better and better in elections. So 1955, they tried to, by-election doesn't work. 1958, they tried to actually break the country apart by dropping bombs on the country. The CIA actually attacks Indonesia as part of a sort of civil war that they fomented. That didn't work. They create a pornographic tape to try to discredit Sukarno to his people. They end up not using that. They come up with a plot to assassinate him. That ends up not happening. And finally, in 1964, as leadership changes in Washington and Sukarno really starts to upset people in the West, again, the British are important here. The CIA and MI6 begin to agitate secretly behind the scenes to create a clash between the very well-armed and US-backed military and the unarmed but very popular Communist Party, knowing very well that in a clash between unarmed and armed parties, the armed party wins and can do so quite horrifically if they choose. And this is exactly what happened. In 1965, this clash does take place, and immediately the US-backed military takes power and proceeds to round up and execute approximately 1 million innocent civilians. Another million innocent people remain in concentration camps. And this is the point of my book. I don't want to get into my own research too much, but this was seen as such a success around the world that other right-wing movements, including in Latin America, saw this as something that they could do themselves with US support or with the approval of the most important people in the US government. And this did happen later. And Chile, in the early 70s, was sort of the most famous implementation of this method.
So let's talk about Chile. It's something close to my own heart. My parents, like other socialists in particularly South Yorkshire, where I was born, took in Chilean refugees who fled the coup after Augusto Pinochet violently seized power and his other generals in 1973. So let's just talk. What's the scene in Chile in 1973? And what's the role then of the US? And of course, at the time, the Secretary of State was Henry Kissinger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. Chile, Allende is really interesting this week to me, although I don't want to draw too many comparisons because these are very different political figures. But they also tried a coup against him before he even took office. So when Allende won, the CIA, at the behest of Nixon, was trying very hard to make sure that he wasn't allowed to take power at all. And they essentially started organizing terrorism in order to stop that from happening, which ultimately ended in the kidnap and murder of the head of the Chilean military, who was against the idea of this or any coup. He was called the constitutionalist, which meant that he was very loyal to letting the winner of the election win no matter what, no matter whether or not he liked the person. So the terror started, I think it's really important to point out, before Allende took power or had the opportunity to make any mistakes. And the terror continued throughout the early 70s with the CIA funding and organizing with several different radical right-wing groups. But Allende did make it for 3 years, and it was only after doing quite well in minor elections that the right really came to the conclusion that no, he absolutely has to go. And there was a certain inevitability to the last few months. Most chillingly, and this is again my sort of focus of research, is that one of those terror campaigns that I described was to write "Jakarta is coming" on the walls of the city, to say basically to the left, we're going to kill you like the Indonesians killed their leftists. And this is precisely what happened on September 11th, as would have it, 1973. The US-backed military really takes launches a quite visible attack on the presidential palace. This is because Allende decides that he's not going to give up. He's not going to find some compromise. He he grabs a gun and sort of tries to defend the capital. And this is one of the reasons that Chile, I think, looms so large in the imagination. Another is that it happened under Nixon, and we had a lot of access to the files that came out when Nixon was sort of chased out of office. And this was the beginning of, again, mass murder now in South America. So Chile and Brazil got together and formed something with Operation Condor with the other South American right-wing dictatorships. And Operation Condor was an international mass murder network. It was basically a way for the countries to coordinate and kill their enemies and perceived enemies across South America. And there's some more horrible resonance with this week because, a lot of the American far right likes to jokingly or not wear T-shirts with helicopters with bodies being thrown out, and this is an homage to what Pinochet's forces did. They would kill their perceived enemies by throwing them out of helicopters. And I think, and again, this is interesting because when I looked into this terror threat that happened, that was sort of scrawled across the walls of Santiago in 1972 and 1973, this Jakarta is coming, we're going to kill you. I think that some of the people that were doing it thought it was kind of a joke. I think that some of the people that actually painted that on the walls believed they weren't really going to do it, and it was just a way to mess with their opponents or to sort of do the thing that Proud Boys do where they make Pinochet jokes or, do the memes about helicopters, which I imagine you probably have in the past. But yeah, this was the arrival of this mass murder technique into South America. And again, Operation Condor had the active participation in the United States government. Sort of like the internet of Operation Condor was supplied by the US. I think it was based in Panama. And this was all done by dictators that knew that this was all done by dictators that knew that they could get away with the violence, that the U.S. to the largest extent possible would cover them in the international sphere. And then, they ended up helping train Central American death squads, and the dictatorships that continued to wage horrible civil war well into the 80s until the end of the Cold War, really.
Now, it is notable that 2 of the 5 coups we spoke about took place under democratic establishments. 3 took place under Republican administrations. But nonetheless, a lot of people might watch this and go, this is all very, very terrible. It's awful. It's horrific. But this was the Cold War. Lots of terrible things happened there. We can all agree, grim time. But this isn't relevant to the here and now. Things have moved on. And whilst we should always remember horrors in the past, it's not relevant to the present.
Yeah, you hear that a lot in the English language. You don't hear Chileans or Guatemalans say it. I think that if somebody sort of attacked Westminster and then it ended up installing a dictatorship in 1973, people in Britain would definitely remember it. I mean, people in Britain definitely think that World War II is relevant. So, but there is some truth to the idea that geopolitical circumstances changed after the end of the Cold War. But I think they changed in ways that are relevant even to what happened on the January 6th in Washington. So the sort of classic military coup, the kind I talked about, the classics of the genre, as I said, they have changed in the last 10 to 20 years. And I spent a lot of time as a correspondent in South America. But often what you tend to see more recently is instead of the very obvious, we're rolling in with tanks, military coup, there's a tendency to try to do things within ostensibly legal structures, right? To use whatever institution you can get hold of to kind of change the rules just enough that you can keep the power structure the way you want it. And I think this is, to the extent that he understood what he was doing at all, kind of what Trump was aiming at. I think he basically just told his perceived underlings to make it happen. But the ways that sort of appeared possible were to get the Supreme Court to rule against the election. In Latin America, we'd call this lawfare, maybe a judicial coup. A lot of people have argued that we've seen lawfare put to great effect in Brazil in the last 10 years. Another way to do this would have been to get Congress to vote that the election happened a different way that it did. And this was, I think, very specifically what was the attempt on January 6th, right? Like he wanted Congress not to certify the electors. In Latin America, in recent years, we would call that a parliamentary coup. Again, people have made the accusations. This is what happened recently in Brazil with the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, or in Paraguay in 2012. So when the Cold War ended, it's not like coups stopped. They took form. They took a different form. But they took a form which I think is more resonant with what maybe was the attempt in 2021 in the United States. Again, I think without a real chance of it happening. But again, in Latin America, in the history of the CIA, MI6, the Global South, there were a lot of times when the CIA tried something very ineffective and very stupid, and it was never going to work, but it still ended up doing real long-term damage to the body politic of whatever nation we were discussing. And historians often point to U.S. intervention in the Global South in the Cold War in a much larger context, and assert that it came after European colonialism in the Global South and after U.S. imperialism in North America and the Caribbean and the Philippines. So a lot of people see the global Cold War as a continuation of imperialism by other means. Sukarno would have called this neocolonialism. And then a lot of people see the war on terror, which took place, in the immediate, a decade after the Cold War ended, as a continuation, as this very American propensity to always be militaristically trying to expand its influence. And all the best historians of sort of global intervention, of U.S. extremism, have pointed to the importance of returning veterans in fomenting far-right movements in the United States, whether it be the KKK itself, veterans returning from the conquest of Mexico back in the middle of the 19th century. And I think it's quite relevant that what came after the Cold War was the war on terror, and we're finding out more and more how many of the people that were active in Washington on January 6th were veterans of the war on terror. And these would have been people that had seen how we treat people in the Black and brown countries we consider inferior. And there's an argument that there's a certain symmetry to this eventually coming home and these methods being applied to the country that gave birth to them.
Vincent, cheers for that. It's been a huge honor. What we've seen is a context which I think is very missing, which is the erasure, the airbrushing out of history of US orchestrated / backed violence in the Global South. That when we see events, suddenly the horror almost is, I suppose that's what George W. Bush, when he talked about these are scenes we see in a banana republic, partly subconsciously or not, he was saying, this is a sort of violence we support or orchestrate abroad, not violence that happens on this soil. That what we've seen is that history is so relevant to the here and now. Please do buy Vincent's book, The Jakarta Method. It's a striking example, and it's got rave reviews rightly, because it shows a history which is otherwise ignored, often for overtly racist reasons, and because it would force us to ask searching questions about the foreign policy that currently exists. Because if we start unpicking the past, then we will start asking very big questions about our assumptions today. So thank you so much, Vincent. It's been a huge pleasure, and thank you for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Stay safe and calm somehow.
Likewise.
Please support this channel for independent thought, discussion of the most important issues that we face.